I spoke to Yukon Huang earlier. He's from the Carnegie Endowment's Asia program, and also he previously served as the World Bank's country director for China. I asked him about the latest economic data and why these numbers have created such a stir.
People have been looking at the trade figures from the Hong Kong side. From the Hong Kong side, they do not show a significant increase in imports from China to match the 16% increase in exports that China is now recording. And part of that is a normal country, depending upon what you look at from the import side, the export side, the numbers do not mesh. They don't mesh because payments and shipments don't always coincide, so they're lags. But there's also an issue of what is the base of the 16%? It's comparison with a year ago, and exports a year ago were relatively low, so 16% is a little bit high. If you compare exports with exports last month, they've only increased by 2 to 3%, and that's fairly modest, and that I think is consistent with what people feel, that the global economy is still not very buoyant, so how come China's exports are so strong? But there's also another factor at play. There's a lot of money flowing around in the region, part of it because of the money flowing in from the United States and Europe, and firms are also probably increasing the value of their invoices so they can bring in some more money because they're doing a little speculation on the side.
The renminbi, the yuan, capital inflows, it's having an impact because the yuan is strengthening against the US dollar. We see that in a various number of charts. But more importantly, is it impacting the economy in China?
I don't think the renminbi is impacting the economy as much as it would have been, let's say, or was a year or two ago, primarily because trade is becoming less important in China's economy. The trade surplus has become smaller. Trade is not actually a significant factor in stimulating growth in China. Growth is being more driven by consumption and investment. So compared to a year ago, 5 years, 10 years ago, I would say that the renminbi, in terms of impact on exports, is not as significant as it used to be.
The monetary policy in China, albeit it's been a little quiet of late, there hasn't been any major issues. Do you see any major shifts in that monetary policy over the course of the next, say, 6 to 12 months?
Well, some people are concerned by the fact that there seems to be a lot of credit floating around. A lot of money has been coming out from the banking system over the last several months. Liquidity is pretty strong, but they haven't seen what they would call the growth response from it. So they're a little bit puzzled by this. Why hasn't credit expansion led to growth? And I think part of the issue is that lots of companies actually have been hoarding cash. They've been hoarding cash on the presumption that the government is going to be tightening up in the future, so it's a little bit of a precautionary motive. There's also some lag from what I call the normal spring vacation periods. There's been a new government in place. People are still watching things. So I would say that the credit expansion has not led to activity as much as people would have guessed.
There's a lot of factors. I want to ask you about inflation, both general inflation and specifically regarding housing. Let's start with housing first, because that's something that always makes headlines in the media or in print. And doing what we do, we always talk about the rise in housing prices, and we're concerned because that's causing an issue in terms of affordability. Is housing still a problem?
I think the government is a bit concerned. The new regime has also continued the policies of the past in keeping a lid on property prices, trying to discourage speculation. They've tightened up the rules. They have a new capital gains tax, which is being implemented by some municipalities, and others are still studying it. It has become harder for people to buy a second house. Down payment requirements have increased. Despite all of this, there's been what I call a modest increase and steady increase in property prices over the last several months. I think part of this reflects the fact that there's a fair amount of credit floating around. It reflects the fact that worldwide, interest rates are fairly low. So people are still asking, what do I do with my money?
Let's talk about the inflation numbers overall. That's a number that we will be focusing on. It hasn't been a problem, at least for the near past. How about the near future?
Well, people had expected that inflation would pick up a little bit, and it hasn't, as you said. They also expected that the credit expansion, with so much money in the system, that this would eventually show up in higher prices, but it's not occurred. So contrast to what people were forecasting a month or two ago of something like 3.5% for this year, now people are talking about it coming down to maybe 2.5%, which is approximately what it is. And so for the moment, I would say inflation is not a big issue in China.